You're about to watch our midweek leadership talk with Cowboy Junction Church. We hope that you're encouraged as you listen to this to grow and become a limitless leader in a world full of limits.
33. I want to show you guys something real quick that is really a progression, and it's two like scenarios, but it's different requests Jesus made. Watch what he says in Mark chapter 6, verse 33. It says, "But the multitude saw them departing, and many knew him and ran there on foot from all the cities. They arrived before them and came together to him." This is Jesus. "And Jesus, when he came out, saw a great multitude and was moved with compassion for them." Really pay attention to the part where it says, and he was moved with compassion. That's a sign of a great leader. A great leader can be moved with compassion.
Right.
There are many times people ask me, why do you go to them? Why do you do what you do? And really, honestly, that would be the definition. You're moved with compassion. You're moved with compassion. Always follow on where you're being moved. And so he began to teach them many things. And he was moved on compassion with them because they were like sheep not having a shepherd. So he began to teach them many things. And when the day was now far spent, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and already the hour is late. Send them away." This is the disciples saying, "Send them away. That they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat." Notice that they're not moved with compassion.
Yeah.
Okay? So you've got Jesus who's moved with compassion, but in the story of the disciples right now, they're still learning leadership and they're frustrated.
Right.
Okay? So that's very important. If you ever get frustrated in ministry towards people, maybe you should pause and think, is this a moment that you should be moved with compassion? Okay? But it keeps going.
Good.
But he answered and said to them, "You give them something to eat." Well, that really put it on the spot for him, didn't it? He's turned to them and said, "Send them away." And he says, "Why don't you give them something to eat?" And they said to him, "Shall we go buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat?" You know the story after this. He takes a little bit and turns it into something big. But now I want you to look at John chapter 6, verse 33, and look at the similarities and the contradictions, okay? And it says, "Then Jesus said to them, 'Most assuredly I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you.'" Now think of the shock of that message. Unless you eat the bread, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you can have no life in you. "Whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up in the last days. For my flesh is blood indeed, and my blood is drink indeed. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood abides in me, and I in him. As the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, so he who feeds on me will live because of me." This is, just imagine if you're sitting in on this and you don't know what he's talking about. This is an intense message. Right. Unless you eat me, unless you drink me. And the disciples are struggling with this. It says then, "This is the bread which came down from heaven, not as my father ate the manna, and not as your fathers ate the manna and are dead. Who eats this bread will live forever." These things he said in the synagogue as he taught in Capernaum. Look at what happens next. "Therefore many of his disciples, when they heard this, said, 'This is a hard saying. Who can understand it?' And when Jesus knew in himself that his disciples complained against this, he said to them, 'Does this offend you? What then if you should see the Son of Man ascend where he was before? It is the Spirit who gives life. The flesh profits nothing. The words that I speak to you are spirit and they are life. But there are some of you who do not believe.'" And that really gets down to the heart of it. Jesus is teaching something hard here. It's easy to say, hey, you give them something to eat and everybody gets to eat. But what about when the message isn't about what you get, but something that's expected out of you? And the message starts getting hard. What if you now, everything's going great, everything's going smooth. It's been a great journey. But now it gets hard. And Jesus says, you've got to realize that this strength you're going to find in doing what I asked you to do is going to be found when you take me on fully, when you embrace me fully. Don't do it on your own. I will give you what you need. Just like you're going to have to eat me and you're going to have to drink me. Is this hard? Does this offend you that I say this? He goes on and he says, verse 62, what then if you should see the Son of Man ascend? Okay, verse 63, it is the Spirit who gives life, the flesh profits nothing. The words that I speak to you are spirit, and they are life. But there are some of you who do not believe. For Jesus knew from the beginning who they were and who did not believe, and who would betray him. And he said, therefore I have said to you that no one can come to me unless it has been granted to him by my Father. From that time, many of his disciples went back and walked with him no more. Then Jesus said to the 12, do you also want to go away? But Simon Peter answered, I love Simon Peter's answer. Lord, to whom shall we go? We've left everything. We don't have anywhere to go. You have the words of eternal life. Also, you have come to believe and know that we also have come to believe and know that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. A couple things. Number one, if you're in the room and you don't have anything but Jesus, you actually are in a really good place. Okay? If you get to the point to where all your eggs are in his basket, you have an opportunity to see some things that very few people are going to see in this world. Some people don't have what it takes for the leadership that God requires of them. But there's a few things that you have to pay attention to. In the first story we read with the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus turns and says, you feed them. Okay? He was moved with compassion. But these same people followed him everywhere. A portion of what we read in the early verses says, did you come to receive only to get more bread and to be fed? I tell you this, eat my flesh and drink my blood. And it was then they were confronted. I don't know if they even realized they were confronted with it. It was all about what Jesus gave in the form of bread and fish and great teaching. But when the rubber met the road and things got tough, Jesus gave a harder message. He wasn't moved with compassion anymore. He was actually raising the level of commitment. Okay? And in a good leader, that is always going to be something you come into contact with. There's a moment where you're going to be asked to raise your level of commitment. Okay? There's two things that happen when this kind of message takes place. When it's not all about coffee at church, when it's not all about, hey, let's all get together and kumbaya, when it's not all about, hey, let's go have a great time together, let's go to Rose's after church. There's a harder message that comes at some point, is I need you to set up and tear down chairs. I need you to be the one that leads the group at Manna Outreach. I need you to the one to let everyone's going to go do their thing, but I need you to be the one that sticks around and does this. I need you to raise your level of commitment. And there's two things that happen. The first one is Jesus clarifies where people stand. That's a quick way to figure out where people are. Okay? And the second thing is it actually purified the organization when people left. Okay? And these are two important things. Because the first one is Jesus had a multitude following him, but he was ready to narrow it down to 12. He had reached that point to where he was going to the cross. He'd reached that point to where he was going to be asked to do something that we know he didn't even want to do, but he had to get in the mind of, I want to do what my Father wants me to do. Let this cup pass from me, but if it's your will, let this cup pass from me. But if it's not your will, then let your will be done. This was getting intense for Jesus, and he could only have people around him that were just as committed as he was. Yeah. As a leader, that's one of the scariest things, is when you're leading a group, especially if it's like as a pastor, if people fall off, there's always people that jump on board. Okay? But as a group leader, you're kind of afraid to lose people. You're afraid to lose people in kids' church. You're afraid to lose people in youth. You're afraid to lose volunteers. You're afraid to lose people at Create. You're afraid to lose people But there's this moment to where you realize, to do what God's called me to do, I have to raise my level of commitment.
Right.
Okay? And it is okay, because Jesus realized where their hearts were. Okay? And Jesus you got to notice, purified the organization by narrowing this down to people whose heart was for God's kingdom.
Yeah.
This wasn't for a t-shirt anymore. If you volunteer, you get a t-shirt. It wasn't for the t-shirt anymore.
Yeah.
It wasn't for the cool coffee mug anymore. It was for, you don't get anything out of this but knowing that what you're doing for the Lord. And for great leaders, that's one of the most important purification processes that you go through in your life, where you realize it's not about the pay, it's not about the popularity, but it's about the personal relationship that we have with Jesus Christ. And I don't do it for any other reason but for Him. I'll tell you this story. Several years ago, we had this big transition take place in our church. And gosh, we were seeing tons of people come to church. We just needed to see people become dedicated to the ministry that God was doing around here. And I went off and prayed. And I really sought the Lord. And I said, Father, give me a story. Give me a parable. Give me something where I can translate the commitment level that needs to rise up in where we were as at Cowboy Junction to where we are as Cowboy Junction. I don't know if y'all remember the Texas Tech football game story. If you haven't heard it, this changed our church's life. I stood before our church and I said, many of you have been going to Cowboy Junction now for 2 or 3 years. Some of you 1 year, some of you your whole life. But this is something that God's asking us to do to raise our commitment level. And I want you to just think about for a minute, if you were a little boy who got invited by your friend to go to the Texas Tech football game with his family. Now his family consisted of his dad and his mom and his brother, which is your friend, and his little sister. And they've got Texas Tech game tickets, and this is going to be your first one. And you'd go to your mom and you'd go, can I go? And she'd say, well, sure you can. And she gave you a $20 bill, and that was for all your concession stand stuff. Remember, did y'all ever have moments like that where your mom always gave you money to make sure you pay for your own things? And then the dad of your friend always paid for all of your stuff. Did you guys ever give your $20 back to your mom? No, I didn't give my $20 back to my mom either. But imagine the little boys on the trip, and there's the 5 of them sitting there, and this is his first one. He's taking in the trumpets blowing. He's taking in the horse running across the field, the football team running out there. It's this incredible chicken skin up your back moment. It's just so cool. And all of a sudden the moment comes where it's halftime, and the dad turns, looks down the line, and says, hey, I'm going to the concession stand. Does anybody want anything? And mom turns and gives her order, and the son turns and gives his order, and the little girl turns and gives his order, and the little boy reaches in his pocket, and the dad said, put your money up, what would you like? And he said, well, I want a Coke and a candy bar, and the dad goes to the concession stand and comes back with his arms full of stuff, okay? I had dads like this in my life, and he sat there and he realized how awesome this was. So I'm going to add 20 years to this story, okay? The little boy is now married to his best friend's sister. And his best friend, who's his brother-in-law now, has a family of his own. And they don't have 5 seats. They have the whole row now, grandkids, and here's grandma and grandpa, and husband and wife, and cousins, and it's a tradition to go to the Texas Tech football game. And along comes halftime, and the dad stands up and he stretches like this, and he turns to grandma and he says, I'm going to the concession stand, what would you like? She gives her order. But what if the son then turns and says, hey, Dad, get me a candy bar and a Coke. And what would you like? And he asked his wife, would you get me this and this? And then the young man that made the trip with him 20 years ago also is now an adult, and he turns and he gives his same order. And all the cousins and all the grandkids give grandpa the order. And all of a sudden you see this older man with 25 people's order for the concession stand. Can y'all see this? Why? Because this is how it's always been. This is grandpa. But what if grandpa looked at grandma, and grandma gave him the nod, and he said, I need you 2 guys to come with me. And he calls his son-in-law and he calls his son to go to the concession stand with him. And they go in the concession stand, they get in the tunnel, he just stops and he turns to him and he says, hey, you know what? I'm going to be honest with you guys. Me and grandma would love to pay for everybody's stuff. But we just can't. And to tell you the truth, it hurts me because I really want to pay for everybody's things for every football game we go to. But if I do, you guys who are grown men now are going to miss out on the blessing that I experienced when you were little. And it was the 5 of us. And I could pay for all your stuff. What if the son turned to the father-in-law and said, well, that is the biggest bunch of bunk I ever heard in my life. You are the most selfish old man I ever heard of in my entire life. What if the son-in-law turned and said, well, we just won't come anymore? I mean, honestly, if you're going to be that cheap that you can't buy our candy bars and Cokes, would that be sorry? But what if both sons go, oh my gosh. Yes, absolutely. In fact, I didn't even think about it. Yes. And all of a sudden, grandma's paying for grandpa, and son's paying for his wife and kids, and son-in-law is paying for his wife and kids. And everybody realizes the blessing is getting bigger, and the blessing has grown threefold. And we're teaching our grandkids that when they get to maturity, they need to pick up the slack, and the commitment level rises. And how many of us go to church, and we turn and we go, well, everybody else, how else did the lights get turned on? Who else serves? And when we finally realize there's a point that you have to say, I've been here long enough that my commitment level needs to rise to the point of not necessarily getting served, but it's time for me to serve. Now, there's going to be people who would do the opposite of what you think they would do.
Right.
The cost is too high. They're too busy, and there's things that are more important. And Jesus said, it's okay, let them go. But the ones who get it, who really get it, will understand what we're trying to do around here. That at some point, someone's got to pick up the slack. It can't be all about the last generation who brought this new generation of believe into Cowboy Junction Church. But now it's this generation rising up and saying, it's time for me to serve. It's time for me to be the person God wants us to be. So as leaders, you have to recognize who are the ones you need to have compassion for. And you'll see them. You'll know it. But there's also ones that you need to say, we need to have a talk. It's time for you to step into servant ministry and to be the leader that you're called to be. And it'll do 2 things. It'll either tell you where people stand, or it'll purify the organization. And for every one person that has left an organization, God always brings 3 more to replace their spots. Every time. In the world we live in, there are so many people that want that kind of commitment level to leadership. And that's why I want to turn to you guys and say, I love you being here. I think being here is incredible. But next week I want you to bring somebody else. I want you to turn to somebody and say, you've been going to Cowboy Junction for a while now. Well, guess what? Your Tuesday mornings are about to be completely different. And I want you to join me. Come be a part of what we're doing. Because I see something in you to where we can make some concession stand trips together. They won't understand the concession stand story, okay? But it's a level of growth. It's a level of maturity. And I think as a leader, you need the permission to recognize who to have compassion for and who to ask commitment from.